Or good morning, or good evening. Welcome to this event here at the Embassy of Lithuania in Washington, D.C. My name is Carl Alto with the Joint Baltic American National Committee, JBank. We represent the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian American communities in the U.S. And I'm very honored to be hosting the event today, the next hour and a half, to join with all of you out there, and a great couple of panels that we have featuring some wonderful speakers, and also wonderful speakers being the ambassadors of the three Baltic countries to the United States. The name of the event is the Day of Mourning and Hope, the living memory of Soviet deportees and displaced persons of the Baltic States. I know as a first generation Estonian American, or a generation that was born in the US, my parents came to the US and they fled from their home countries in 1944, but they were certainly affected, as were all of the citizens of the Baltic countries on this day 80 years ago. And my mother, who is still alive, she's 93, I've had a chance to talk with her about her experience, and every time I'm home visiting with her, I do ask her about those days. And just this weekend, I wanted to refresh my memory about what her experience was like. She was then 13 years old in 1941, and her father, being an officer in the Estonian army, had to go underground when the Soviets began rounding up people. And by that time, my mother's family had left Tallinn, the capital, to the countryside, to a place called Kohila, where there were a lot of forests then. I don't know if there still are now, hopefully. And stayed with some distant relatives there, and were able to avoid the grasp of the KGB, or then the NKVD, and the Soviet occupying forces. And my grandfather had slept in the woods. He would occasionally come into the place where my parents and my mother's family was staying to reunite with them. But perhaps the most incredible episode happened not too long after that, when my mother, she doesn't remember if it was her younger brother or sister, along with her mother, my grandmother. They were out in the woods looking for berries or mushrooms. It was, I suppose, later in June or July in the summer, and suddenly a very bedraggled team of Soviet soldiers approached them in the middle of the forest, and you can imagine that what my grandmother must have felt with two young children. Actually, the Soviet soldiers were there to ask on behalf of my grandmother if she could help them surrender. They didn't want to surrender directly to the German forces who had come in, but they wanted her to mitigate their surrender with the local authorities, or as well as could be managed. And my grandmother did that. My mother remembers that she was her mother, my grandmother, was shaking literally, and especially when they went to the police. The office that was located nearby, and the officer had asked, of the Soviet soldiers, do you have any weapons? And they took out guns and hand grenades and put them on the table, and my grandmother's knees almost buckled at that. But that was what my one personal story from 1941, or what I'm trying to remember as best I can. I know we have some interesting stories today. We're all the children or grandchildren of survivors. Many of our parents, our friends, our family who fled from the Baltic countries for their lives ahead of a foreign invasion or occupation, murder and mayhem. As survivors, we are compelled to remember, and we remember those who did not make it, and many, very many did not, and we remember those who fought for freedom, and many of us who are survivors were forced to fight for freedom, and we remember those who disappeared or were forcibly deported on this date 80 years ago. Because we have to remember and make sure something like this never happens again. It is no surprise that today is also very important because it is the day of the NATO summit, which happened earlier today, or is happening today in Brussels. These events, I see in my mind that they are related. We fought as Baltic Americans, as the citizens of the Baltic countries, the free Baltic countries. We fought for the restoration of freedom 31 years ago, and we made sure that we would find protection, that we would find safety, that we would find security and stability by joining NATO. But today, here at this event, we want to remember how we got here, and to signify this day, and remember it is a day of remembrance, but also a day of hope. So with that short introduction, I wanted to turn now to my co-panelists who are here live at the Lithuanian Embassy, the ambassadors of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and maybe first just to have a quick introduction of the three ambassadors, and then I'll turn it over to them. They will give short remarks, and we'll have a short discussion then that will follow, and then we will transition to our second panel. It's a really great pleasure to meet for the first time the new ambassador of Lithuania to the United States, Ms. Audra Plepytė, who just arrived in Washington a few weeks ago. And I think with all three of the ambassadors, it's kind of a sense of deja vu because they're here. We recognized each other, and they have all been in Washington before, some more than once or twice in an official capacity. So it's kind of like a family reunion in a way. Ambassador Plepytė, who was here, was actually a counselor at the embassy a long time ago in 1999, before the Baltics became members of NATO. And then in the meantime, she was ambassador to Spain. She was the permanent representative to the United Nations just as of late, and now is here in Washington as Lithuania's ambassador to the United States. And then to her left is Māris Selga, the ambassador and I guess the senior ambassador of the Baltic countries in Washington, D.C. He has been here since August 2018, and this is his, I believe, second official posting in Washington. I remember him from 2004 to 2008 when he was the deputy chief of mission, and he's been all over the world, literally, in the meantime, as ambassador to Egypt and other countries, and most recently, China. So he definitely has a global view of things. And then to my immediate left, Kristjan, Prikk, the new ambassador, also just arrived a few weeks ago, new ambassador from Estonia. And he's been here in the US a number of times before in various capacities, but most recently also served in a couple of senior positions at the Ministry of Defense, and also as the undersecretary and other positions, permanent undersecretary, if I have that right. Yes, Diplo speak, but it's all Wonderful to have all of you here, and I think now we'll turn it over to Ambassador Plepytė, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carl, and thank you for being with us. It's really my pleasure and honor to host my colleagues here in our embassy, Latvian and Estonian colleague, and also J Bank, and as well to zoom in with such a nice and wonderful people panelists for our discussion, and hope many people can join us via Zoom and see our streamline live in Facebook. For us, for Lithuanians, but as well for Latvians and Estonians, it's very sad and emotional day, 14th of June. It's now on this day, 80 years ago, in the middle of the night, men, women, and children in Lithuania, as well as in Latvia and Estonia, were rounded up, arrested, taken from their beds, homes, jumped into railroad cattle cars, and sent thousands of miles to the Arctic death camps, actually. Very few of them survived. Deportation were act of genocide. That's very clear. Stalin's terror was aimed at breaking the will of people, at breaking the spirit and desire to live free in their homelands and build the future they chose. From the 1941 to 1953, more than 130,000 people were deported only from Lithuania, and another 156,000 were imprisoned. There is not a single family in Lithuania that has not been touched by these atrocities. None of the men, women, even elderly or newly born stay here and save. The tradition where we read aloud the names of deportees, pay respect to these real people who had their hopes and dreams cut short, and carry their memories forward. We think that should help us understand what happened, then learn from it and do everything in our powers as if this horror would never repeat. And I'm very glad as well here that we had that today with Latvians and Estonians ambassadors, but also with Latvian and Estonian communities as well, and commemorated and speaking about that. And I see our famous author, Rūta Šepetys, and she wrote one of the wonderful books, best-selling books, Between the Shades of Grey, and I know it was popular in many, many countries. When I was in Spain, we had also presented this country to the Spanish audience. It was the first and very important book to show our experience that would learn other nations what happened and what we experienced that. And we speak about that, remembering what happened, but also having hope that would never happen, that because we act today out of our experience from the past. We looked to the future through the lenses of the past as well, and knowing what kind of atrocities and awful things, outrageous things our grandparents and grandparents and parents had to overcome. So we would have to do everything to prevent any such atrocities happening now or in the future. That's our duty based from past to work for better future. Now we are members of NATO. We are in the safer side, but anyway, have to be vigilant. But we have to be also fighting for any respect, for every respect of every human rights in any corner of the world, and also to prevent if we see that such things might happen, or that some irrespective rise of hatred, rise of also including anti-Semitism, rise of violation of human rights. That's the basic things which could lead also to such atrocities, and something any totalitarian regime should be accountable. So I think that's what I wanted to say, is also remember, we remember, but we also have a hope that the world will be better and we will never repeat that what happened to our ancestors. So thank you once again. I'm looking forward as well to this good discussion during.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Those were very heartfelt comments and remarks. I wanted to turn it over now to Ambassador Selga. Māris.
Thank you very much, Karl, and thank you very much to our Lithuanian colleagues for hosting us today. Dear friends and colleagues, of course, on this day we remember tragedy and the crime. We mourn the innocent men, women, children, and seniors who were deported on June 14, 1941. And it's, of course, it's difficult to find words that convey the horrors experienced by thousands of Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians deported 8 years ago today. The deportation, as my Lithuanian colleague mentioned, took place at night with the families pulled from their beds and crammed into railway cars meant for cattle, not people, to be transported to Stalin's Gulag labor camps. The journey to Siberia itself was inhumane. Families were separated, conditions were cramped, and young babies died in the arms of their mothers, and people suffered horrible illnesses. Those that survived the journey were subjected to barbaric conditions in Siberian labor camps, with many not surviving the first winter. Only a small part of those deported in 1941 later returned to Latvia. All of us continue to live with the collective trauma caused by this crime. The horror of this crime against humanity is passed on for generations and must never be forgotten. But I also want to say, the Soviet regime failed. It failed to achieve the main goal behind these deportations. It failed to break the spirit of the Baltic people. The Soviet regime did not only wish to punish and hurt the deportees. The goal was to instill fear and take away hope. But it's, as we sit here today, the ambassadors of three free and democratic nations, we know that our people were not broken and hope remained. It is inspiring that despite knowing, seeing, and even experiencing the horrors of deportations, so many Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians continue to have hope and fight for freedom. Small and big examples of this hope and the unbreakable spirit of the Baltic people was evident through the years of Soviet occupation, including in 1989 when we come together for the Baltic Way. Ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, we must never forget the events of June 14, 1941. Such a tragedy must never happen again. Today's event has a very fitting name, a day of mourning and hope. As we mourn and remember all the innocent victims of his crime, we can also be proud, despite the pain. We are nations that survived the communist genocide. We could not be broken. Our hope remained. So I would like to thank our Lithuanian colleagues for hosting this meaningful event, and I look forward, of course, to today's discussion, and I'm grateful that we can come together as friends to remember and also hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Māris, for the hopeful message and the positive message. And now, Ambassador Kristjan, please.
Thank you, Karl. I wish we had a festive reason to be here at the Lithuanian embassy today, and I thank the Lithuanian embassy and all the other organizers very much for setting up this event today. But as we all know, June 14th is a very sad and dark day in in the history of our nations. Every Estonian family has their own tragic, outrageous story about the Soviet deportations, the Soviet horrors. But it all blends into one big, dark story about tragic fate of nation and many nations under the Soviet terror during the 20th century. Estonia lost net total of 10,000 people on this very day in 1941. 10,000 out of a nation of 1 million. Mostly men were arrested and either executed or sent to forced labor camps, where again most died due to malnutrition, harsh climate, hard labor without any tools or proper clothing, and of course the inhumane living conditions. Now, children, women, and the elderly family members were deported, just like it happened in Latvia and Lithuania, also actually in Ukraine and Moldova on the very day. Were deported in cattle trains to remote locations, in Estonian case, mostly in Kirov and Novosibirsk oblasts, half the world away, where they were left to either die or to struggle to barely live somehow. Very few of them actually returned. But we lost more than just 10,000 of fine, good human beings, our countrymen and women. This cold-blooded, well-planned, and well-executed operation was a targeted action to wipe out the elite of the society, to break the backbone of the nation as it existed. So we lost a significant percentage of those who had served and led our country before the occupation, and the hopes were shattered that the atrocities that started immediately after the occupation in 1940 were just one-off temporary nightmare. It's 80 years now since the events took place in 1941, but it is very important to have this event and other events of this kind in our respective countries today, and in many senses. Firstly, we have to always remember these people that suffered, whose sufferings began on this very day, and whose lives were shattered forever. Secondly, and this is where the hope part becomes relevant, we have to remember it to make sure that we always understand that freedom is not free, that there have been huge sacrifices there, but we now have a really hopeful, nice future ahead of us that we can make happen. And third, which is very important as well, I hope that our tragic and very difficult historic experience serves as a hope, a source of hope and inspiration for many other nations who still suffer under oppressions of different kind, but where the common denominator is the same, that these nations cannot do what is their collective intent right now, but they are under oppression of some other power, some other ideology. We were able to become free nations again. We are members of EU and NATO, and as Carl pointed out, it's very fitting that it happens to be today that the NATO heads of state and government came together in Brussels today. And hopefully the other nations, they can just get some inspiration and hope from our experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kristjan. That's a lot to take in. We have, I think, just about 5 or 10 minutes for a little discussion right now. I see that a number of people have written questions, or actually more comments online, and some are just telling of personal stories. And if we don't get right to bringing up these personal experiences right now, we will try to do so during the course of the event today, because I think they're well worth mentioning. Mostly having to do with resources, about available resources in the Baltic countries right now, for people who want to investigate what would happen to their family members. And I know that even back in the 1980s, I think there were individuals and movements in the Baltics to begin to uncover this past that had been just a black hole for decades and decades. under the Soviets. That's a very important element. And then about the curricula in the Baltic countries, because really in remembering these events and these days in the deportations, I know we do that in March 25th for the 1949 deportations, which were even larger in the three countries, and then in August 23rd, which is the kind of the beginning of everything, which was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Hitler-Stalin Pact from August 23rd, 1939. Without the agreement of Stalin and Hitler to collaborate together and to divide, to make a plan to divide Europe and subjugate halves of Europe, these things would not have not occurred. So in discussing let's say the historical narrative and dealing directly with the closest neighbor to the Baltic countries, and that's the Russian Federation, I know that there are ongoing issues about the narrative, about the World War II legacy, and I think we have a moral obligation to continue to point out the injustices that to us are so obvious, and I think to the world should be so obvious. And what are some of the things that your countries are doing to first of all to sort of rectify, to make the story whole of the missing parts of history, and then also to make sure that the narrative is understood and it's not the false narrative. And there are many nuances to history. Obviously, we have Audra here on the second panel, who deals with these questions, and Rūta Šepetys on a daily basis. But now, just to turn to the ambassadors, maybe for a quick down the road, starting with the Lithuanian ambassador, about your experience and what your country is doing to address these issues.
Thank you, Carl. And answering your question about the history and how we learn, I would say, about these atrocities, because until 1990, so until very late 1980s, 1989, very little was known about that, because that was only horror stories we were told in the families, and not even in every family, because as we know from human beings, it's very difficult to speak about traumatic and bad experience about the past. So that's very few people spoke about that. We knew, as me as well as a kid and as a student, we knew something, but not in such a details and not in such a vast phenomena for the whole country. So during these last 3 decades, I would say this gap, what was tried to really to fill in with the true stories, first of all, of the people who were in Siberia, their memories. They're trying to write as many memories as possible. Still, the witnesses were alive, and their children were talking. It's good now that in Lithuania, lots of historians, scholars are working on that as well. I think it's very important to involve really professionals in that. It's one thing, of course, relying on what the people say, the experience we still have, but also to make that, and it is already part of our history. So that to be a scientific point of view, especially what I wanted to say, that you mentioned a bit about the Russians' attempt to rewrite the history and to neglect and to say that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact didn't exist and deportations were not in such a mass scale, or they didn't exist or something like that. So we have to counterbalance that. I think it's our obligation to speak about those things, speak also emotionally, trying to understand, that people would understand, but also scientifically providing the evidence, and that's really important. And I don't know, I mean, no go to the details, but we have also in Center of Genocide and Holocaust Museum, I'm sorry, and some museums. So there would be lots of people and institutions which speak about that, but so we do that. And I would say Maria Chivas, I think she will speak about one of the experience and mission, so-called Mission Siberia or Misijas Bibras, which is for the young people who went to those places of deportation and clean the cemeteries, spoke with the people living there. So they tried to get information about the people who were deported in the Siberia from being there. It's unfortunately it's closed now. We don't get cooperation from the Russian side, so it's not possible to go there. So there are lots of activities also going in the Lithuania, how to really get facts about what happened, emotions. But I think it's also our obligation to speak about that, while not only to our own people, which we have to do that as well, but also to the wider audience, to worldwide, just that they would, from our experience, they would draw lessons and not to repeat, and how to prevent such atrocities in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Selga, you had said that the Soviet regime had failed, and I totally agree. The Nazi regime failed too, and just looking through my emails today, I saw that June 14th is also a day, not in 1941, but in 1941. The Nazi deportations, first deportations to Auschwitz began in Poland, and Poland then, of course, was overrun. And we can't forget that there were the wars and the double occupations affected all Baltic citizens, whether they were Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Jews, Baltic Germans, small Swedish minority in Estonia. Roma, everybody was affected, everybody suffered. And but what in the case of Latvia are you would you like to discuss? I think which is important to remember for the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Carl. I think I can agree with what my Lithuanian colleague Audra said. I mean, so that it's, you know, starting from governmental institutions, from documentation part, books and documentaries, everything regarding those terrible events which happened 80 years and a little bit later, as well as you mentioned, you know, deportation in 1949 was even on a larger scale. In all three Baltics, I think we in that March we lost about 100 people from altogether from Baltic states or republics, as Soviet Union was calling us at the moment. Well, the interesting part, of course, is that when deportation took place in 1941, and not relatives and or friends of the deportees received, of course, there was no information, there was nothing in the news, and of course, Soviet authorities refused to take any responsibility or to provide any explanation. And we have to, of course, mention that the world itself was also silent, as Baltic nations actually experienced one of the most tragic events of the 20th century. I would like also to come back 1 year earlier in 1940. So you mentioned dates regarding Nazi occupation and those atrocities. I mean, on June 17th, actually, Latvia was occupied by Soviet Union 1 year before deportation. So that and actually deportations itself started already, you know, from the very beginning of Soviet occupation. The interesting part about, you know, remembrance and how do we remember, I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, the Soviet Union was not, let's say, ready to speak about it, but the end of 80s, within Soviet Union, we were still, you know, under occupation and under the Soviet rule. There was one movie in Latvia, I mean, produced, I think that was 7 or 8 series, I mean, regarding deportation of, you know, including everything what Latvia has managed to live through. I mean, I think there was also Lithuanian actors playing as well in that movie, so that showed also to the you know, to the communities in Soviet Union that there has been something going on in 40s, so regarding occupation. So I think that was the first time when we can say that Soviets somehow recognized that there has been, you know, let's say the crime against our nations in 40s. So of course it was with, you know, Soviet type sugar topping, but it still was the first time when these events actually were mentioned and shown that it was, you know, very hard life in Siberia and everything else. So that it's with a, let's say, happy ending for that family, but of course. At least it opened eyes also for those in end of 80s and beginning of 90s who were, you know, looking for freedom and ending the Soviet rule. So that I think that I can agree with what Audra said, that, you know, we are still in process, but I think Latvia is we have fantastic museum of occupation, which covers, you know, everything starting from Soviet occupation, of course, including Nazi occupation as well. So that it's trying to show, you know, why and how it happened and what shouldn't happen in future.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Selga. We only have a couple of minutes left, so sometimes it's not the best being third, but Ambassador Prikk, you have the last word now.
Thank you, Carl. Well, the story of our nations is very similar when it comes to the Soviet atrocities, and in a way we've been together also in this process of getting to know better what exactly happened, and also making sure that this memory does not fade, and that we can continue to tell the story to our kids, our grandchildren, and also other nations out there. What I can say though is that whereas there was certainly a wave of interest and research in this whole subject or set of different topics in the end of 80s and 90s and the beginning of 90s, sort of on the wave of this national awakening and regaining the independence. I think it's fair to say that there is a next wave now, and this has been triggered by different sort of events and reasons, and certainly the fact that the Russian Federation is more and more trying to avoid any responsibility, any mention of this history that actually has been very tough on Russian people as well. This has certainly also influenced our reaction. What is important is that the Museum of Occupations and Freedom that we have in Tallinn has been a tremendous source of information and in a weird way also the source of inspiration for many people to actually go back to their roots, try to find what happened to their grandfathers, grandmothers, along with the quite new victims of communism memorial in Estonia. A very nice memorial. I urge everyone to visit that. To get this very powerful emotion, and you definitely, after visiting memorial, you feel that you need to know more about that, and actually together with the memorial, a thorough website and a database on victims of communism was launched. So everyone can go to this website. I believe it's memorial with AA.ee, and look for their grandparents or for any family names of those people that they know, and try to find out what happened to them. And this in turn has created more interest in filling the gaps and finding data on these people that we still don't know about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Prikk. And I wanted to thank all three of the ambassadors for being here, particularly Ambassador Plepytė from the Lithuanian Embassy for being a host for this cutting edge event today. I know we've just scratched the surface of the magnitude of the event. Hopefully we can dissect a little bit more in the second panel. So we give a virtual applause to all of you, and thank you again for being here. And at this point, we are going to switch over to our second panel, and I believe they're all up on the screen today. Right now, and I just wanted to, and I apologize for running a little bit over time, but so with that in mind, I wanted to have just quick introductions of our next three panelists, and they will be speaking in the order that I introduced them. First, many of you may know, and I'm very fortunate to know also, Rūta Šepetys, who's an internationally acclaimed author of historical fiction and the author of Between Shades of Grey, which is made into a film, Ashes in the Snow, which I've seen actually twice, and both times in the U.S. Capitol. So very wonderful film, I think describes so much from a ground level view of a person's experience of being ripped away from her homeland and ending up in the deepest, darkest gulags. Our second speaker is Dr. Māris. She's an associate professor of history at Bronx Community College and in the city, University of New York. She's researched women deportee experiences in Latvia, which is a topic actually very, very near and dear to my heart too. I just got to review a book related to Latvian heroes, actually, which is being translated into English, people who helped others in Latvia survive, and those included many women and others who had fled to the west. And then our third speaker is coming to us from Chicago, Maria Šyvas, who's the president of the U.S. Lithuanian Youth Association. She was a very avid participant in Mission Siberia, which was a Lithuanian initiative, and she has transitioned now in her role to a new initiative, which she'll be telling us more about. So with all that, these quick introductions, Rūta, the floor is yours, or the airwaves are yours, so please.
Thank you. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here. I want to thank all three ambassadors and Carl Alto and J Bank and my fellow panelists here. And I also want to thank all of the ambassadors and consuls worldwide who have worked so hard for so many years to build and nurture Baltic communities abroad. We're so grateful for you. And as the ambassador mentioned today, I'm also thinking about our friends and neighbors of countries like Finland and Ukraine and Moldova, Romania, Poland, and some of the Russians themselves who were also subjected to this fate of Siberia. And the poet Anna Blandiana said that when justice cannot shape memory, remembering the past can be a form of justice. And so today, on this day, June 14th, we remember we reflect, and most importantly, we gather to share story and history. And again, I'm so honored to be part of that. I'm an author of historical fiction, and 16 years ago, while on a trip to Lithuania, I was inspired to write a novel about the deportations. And I began the book in 2005. Every publisher in the United States passed on it. They said the topic was too obscure, it wouldn't interest readers, it was too dark, it was too sad. And after 6 years, so from 2005 to 2011, just trying to get it published, I finally found a publisher for it. And it was published in 2011. So this is the 10-year anniversary of the book, Between Shades of Gray, which is published as a crossover novel. So a book for both students and adults. And for the past 10 years, I have had the honor to travel the world, meeting educators and students and readers, discussing this part of history. And I've been so inspired by the continuing conversations of the past decade. Together, we've studied totalitarianism and systems of power, and how the deportations and occupation of the Baltics, how they denied the citizens probably the most powerful fundamental human right, that of choice. And people might say, oh, the most, powerful, fundamental human element is love. No, but we choose to love. We choose to be compassionate. But these human beings were denied the elements of choice. But yet, in that way, the history and deportations are such a powerful study because they illuminate both sides. They illuminate the love of power, and they also illuminate the power of love. And that's so inspiring. And today, as we mark the 80-year anniversary of the deportations, my mind and heart are with those who experienced it, with those who perhaps didn't have a chance to tell their story, who didn't have a chance to record their memoir or publish their very important book about it, because I imagine that every human experience of deportation was different, and every experience is important. And I'm also reflecting on the term survivor, which has been mentioned a few times, because we often hear this term, right, associated. Baltic people are survivors. But a recent essay I read made me reflect on the fact that maybe Baltic people are not only survivors, but revivers. The Baltics, they determined and chose that they would rise again, that they would rebuild, that they would choose resilience, and that they would use their struggle to find strength, to build a stronger and better future. So in that way, I'm thinking about revivers as well. And moving forward now, the Baltics continue to use their experience to set an example and to support others and neighbors, extend their support to victims of oppression, and let them know that they are seen and they are not alone. And so on this very important day, I would like to briefly share a visual example that I hope will speak to the sense of hope on this day of mourning. I'd like to introduce you to some of the future ambassadors, the young people who are the ones who are going to carry our fading stories into the future. They are wise, they are full of empathy, and they are full of energy and emotional truth. And so I'm going to share my screen briefly so I can introduce you to some of these amazing people. And first, what I'll do is I will give you context. Here are the 3 editions of my book, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian. This would not be possible without all of my publishers, and most importantly, my translators, who are giving voice to the story in other language. Madam Ambassador mentioned the film, and so did Carl, Ashes in the Snow, which is the contribution and many years' work of director and producers Māris and Žilvinis Naujokas. We have film editions of the book. We have the English edition of the book. And in October, my publisher is releasing a graphic novel edition of the book. This is because everyone absorbs story in different ways. Some people absorb it visually. Some people absorb it through comics and graphics. Oh, sorry about that. And so now the book that no one wanted to publish is published in 60 countries and over 47 languages. And they all interpret the history and story differently. They come up with different titles and different covers. And again, this would not be possible without all of my translators. And what means so much is that the book is even published in countries where the struggle for freedom continues. In Ukraine, there's even an edition in Iran. And here are some of our future ambassadors. This is a school in South Africa that for the past 10 years has used the Baltic history as required reading. And I meet with them each year. And do you know that now that it's been 10 years, and I'm getting old very quickly, some of these beautiful young women who were students at the time are now teachers in South Africa, and they are teaching this history. The same in Mongolia. It's required reading in Mongolia. This is in Mexico when I arrived, and the students in Mexico were holding signs for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia saying, "We see you." In Japan, the book is used at a collegiate level. They feel the topic is a bit dark and sad for, let's say, middle school or high school. In Tarragona, Spain, on June 14th, today, they celebrate every year. And the school in Tarragona has an exercise. They ask students, you have 20 minutes. What do you pack if you are forced to leave everything you've ever known and loved behind? One school, a group in a STEM school read the book, and they were so moved that they decided in the hallways of their school to create a museum to honor the people of the Baltics. A school in Massachusetts made it a required read for their 7th and 8th grade classes. And when they gathered to discuss it, they gathered dressed in the colors of the Lithuanian flag. And I just have to point out to you that these students, they aren't Baltic. They are simply inspired by the incredible resilience and the force of life and the power of love exhibited through Baltic history. This is one of most meaningful. A school in Massachusetts found an assisted living facility that had Baltic residents, and they did a joint read of the book, and then they got together to discuss it. And the woman said, I can't believe that I'm meeting a 7th grader who's reading about Siberian deportation. And the 7th grader said, I can't believe I'm meeting someone from World War II who's still alive. I mean, and these intergenerational conversations are so beautiful and meaningful. And, you know, young people, they're so expressive. They're expressing themselves in the history through art. Students in Kentucky represented Lithuania and memory preservation at the United Nations Assembly. A little school on the island of St. Kitts, they have 12 students, and they read the book and sent this message. And again, why is this important? Because sometimes when history remains hidden in the shadows, the people who experience that history, maybe they feel misunderstood or that the world has forgotten them. And when I originally researched the book in 2005, I received a lot of help from Plepytė, the members of the Lithuanian Association who were deported to the Laptev Sea. And this is Irena Spakauskienė helping me on my research trip. And now fast forward 16 years later, we are bringing students from countries all over the world to Rumšiškės. And Irena is explaining the history and the story. This group of young men raised money themselves to come to the Baltics and tour and discover the history for themselves. And now we're joining together young Baltic students with young American, Canadian, Australian students in other countries to move forward. And I look at this picture and it warms my heart. These young men who are amongst the young men who raised the money themselves to come and study this history, they could have spent the money on video games, on sports, on something for their family. And they chose to bring their school's cross to the Hill of Crosses. And appropriate for today, this is a group of Lithuanian students who came to the United States and are meeting with American students to discuss Article 5 of the NATO Charter. And they did a joint read. And then students traveled back to Lithuanian Parliament. So you see this intergenerational hope. And on Lithuanian Independence Day, a school sent me this photo saying, we are commemorating you today and we are celebrating you. And when I traveled to a school, I stopped in the hallway and I had to take a picture of this poster. They had read about the history of the Baltics, about the resilience, about the rebuilding, and they thought this represented your history. Believe there is good in the world, be the good in the world. And so I've spent the past decade creating a foundation and introducing readers around the world to this history. But really, we're just getting started because you commented on this topic of false narrative. And my work is fiction. And we have to remember that. My work is fiction. What's important are the real stories. So now, after a decade, I'm beginning what I think is the most important work, directing readers worldwide to the real stories and the testimonies of the true witnesses. And that's why I'm so honored to intersect with my fellow panelists here who have engaged in that valuable work. And the institutions that we've mentioned, the museums, the cultural institutions in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they have captured these testimonies. There are video archives with thousands of hours of testimony. And so my endeavor now that I've started upon is to hire translators to create English captions for these video archives for so many of the important memoirs and journals and nonfiction books that have been published on the topic. Why? My hope is that we can consolidate these testimonies and consolidate them into a Baltic archive where perhaps one day they can sit, let's say, at the Witness for Humanity archive at the University of Southern California, next to the testimonies from the Holocaust survivors, Museum of Genocide, victims of mass violence and crimes against humanity. So that's the next step. My sincere thanks to all of you. Again, we're just getting started and you are helping me do what I think is my life's work, but what I know is my heart's work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rūta, for that uplifting talk. And it's great that there are revivalists there, revivers, and some of us are survivors, but we need the revivers. Without further ado, Dr. Lazda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you indeed for that really inspirational, all your work, Rūta. And because I've been thinking a lot about today and what living memory means, and that means taking action. And so, I hope what we can get to in the discussion, I'll keep my comments pretty brief, but is thinking about what are our next steps, right? That memory is not something static, that we can just collect these testimonies and put them on a shelf and say that we've done our job, right? But it is, as you have, and clearly you have worldwide influence and are really creating memory carriers and revivers, and thank you for that. It's truly inspiring. And so what I'm going to do in my brief time is kind of pick up where Rūta has left us, and that is talk a little bit about the testimonies. And just a little bit, because I think we know, in general, many of us here today have heard these stories and we have shared common experiences. But I still think it is appropriate to provide space for the voices of those who went through the deportations on this 80th anniversary. So just give you a little bit about myself and how I came to this topic. Growing up with parents who are refugees from Latvia in World War II, I had an awareness of the June 14th deportations. But even though I knew this history, I really only began to understand and to feel this history when, as a history graduate student at Indiana University, I had the opportunity to participate in an oral history expedition with the National Oral History Center at Riga, Latvia. And that inspired me, that really brought home how the deportation experience had affected truly every family in Latvia and across the Baltic, across Eastern Europe itself. So I listened to hundreds of hours of recorded testimonies, conducted my own interviews, and also tried to keep up with the flow of memoirs that was coming out at the time in the 1980s and 1990s. So I want to share a couple of these testimonies, and they come from women deportees. And women deportees were more likely to survive the deportation. And one of the most devastating aspects that has already been mentioned of these deportations is that families were separated as a deliberate policy of the deportation instructions, which meant that the fates were often different for men and women. Men were sent to the more brutal penal or labor camps or simply shot. While women and children, the elderly, were more likely sent to labor colonies where they had more of a chance of survival. So there are just my few examples. I want to highlight two themes that appear in women's testimonies. And that is, the two themes are trauma and hope, kind of these two different aspects of the deportations that we're trying to understand and bring together today. So deportee trauma is expressed in many ways, beginning with arrest and the separation at the train station. The loss of husbands and of fathers, which again was deliberately set up so that would be a surprise. They did not suspect this would happen until they got to the train station. It was not only painful, but it was also completely disorienting. They had lost that family structure and lost much of the root that had kept them together. So all deportation memoirs describe the inhumane conditions that have also been mentioned today. The deportees lost control not only of their futures, but also of the most intimate aspects of their lives. Many deportees comment on the humiliation and the shame they felt in being forced to expose their bodily functions to others in the cattle cars. As one woman recalled, and I'll quote from her interview, "It was impossible to take care of nature's needs in the cattle car. And having lost all sense of shame, we begged to be let out. Right there by the wagon, I saw one woman who, with tears flowing down her face, was taking care of her needs." Commenting on the sense of privacy, on this invasion of privacy, on this invasion of both psychological and physical, is found in many other accounts of Lithuanians, Estonians. The Polish historian Catherine Jalik describes this a kind of imposed intimacy. Now, I hesitated sharing this example today because it is so personal and intimate and is uncomfortable for us to hear. But it's a central story found in deportee narratives, and is a powerful example of how women deportees try to communicate their trauma to those of us who did not experience it. And it is our responsibility, I think, to listen and to hear and to share these stories. So arrival to their destinations also brings shock and adds to their trauma, the brutal weather conditions, and what one woman described as the, quote, unfathomable cold-heartedness of the young toward everything living. But with time, deportees found hope. So a second theme that I want to convey here today is, where do they find this hope? They find hope in each other. They adopt new family members. One woman recalled taking in an elderly woman as her mother so that she would have a better chance of survival, because alone this older woman could not work and therefore could not receive any rations or any food. Women find hope and solidarity with deportees of other nationalities and the local Russian population. There was little tension between Latvians and other ethnic populations based on national differences. They saw themselves as victims of a shared fate. And I'll quote from another testimony, people there lived in poverty. Men had been taken from every family and they had died in the war. So more women than men worked there. They also picked potatoes with us. Life was hard for them also. In another instance, she recalled, I remember the old Russian woman who, with a bit of bread or a container or milk hidden under their aprons, were at their gates waiting for us as we came home from work. The shared experiences with women of other nationalities and the shared fates with the other deportees cultivated relationships that helped Latvian women adapt to life in Siberia. Finally, women found hope in their dreams of returning home to Latvia. Despite finding solidarity and finding a way to settle, women were determined to return home. As one recalled, the only thought that kept us going was that we have to survive today. Tomorrow the world will end and we'll all go home. Some realized as time went on and they settled, the economic conditions may have been even better for them in Siberia than in Latvia. But as Nina stated, even though they, quote, knew nothing was left in Latvia, nothing can replace your homeland. So the few examples I've shared today are not particular, again, to this particular group or to Latvians. There's similar life stories found in Lithuanians, Estonians, Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians. We've built a large library of the written and oral testimonies that bear witness to the violence of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. But to conclude, I want to return to this idea of what does it mean to have a living memory, and to remind us of the significance of the testimonies for not just to have a historical record, but for democratization. I mean, as we also know, for the Baltic states, remembering the victims of the June 14th deportations was a key element in a symbol of resistance to Soviet occupation and the struggle for independence in the 1980s. As an Estonian historian and politician Mart Laar wrote in 1988, it was time to return the history to the nation and to return, quote, life history back to the individual. Collecting and sharing testimonies were tied to democratization, which were then also reinforced by the demonstrations that eventually people dared to come together in public to commemorate. This was the first stage, I would think, I would like to say, in recalling this past. And now we've entered the second stage that also, not maybe the second, maybe it's the second or the third stage. And as both Rūta as well as the Estonian ambassador mentioned, of acting on this memory and reminding us of the connection it has to democratization and continuing to tell these stories as a way of connecting to our role in defending democracy as well as in sharing it more broadly. And there are 3 points of continuity I'd like to conclude with. One is going back to the histories of the testimonies themselves and recognize they did not end, the story of deportation did not end with the return of the deportees to their home countries. In many cases, they carry the experience of deportation with them, which continue to challenge their integration into society. The second continuity I would like for us to recall is that, of course, the 1941 deportations only marked the beginning of deportation. Only that the 1941 deportations were followed by more Soviet deportations, as well as here to include the deportations of the Jewish populations from the Baltic states, that we share this common fate. And so finally, to allow the third continuity I would like us to consider building on as we go to the next step in the living memory is recognizing our commonality and solidarity, not only as national experiences, but also international experiences with the many nationalities that were not only deported from Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, but also looking at the more global experience together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lazda. It really made me think also that, as a single nation, we're all, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all small countries. So we really need to work together, and in this case, share our memories. And I think we really get it. I mean, through all the, my whole life, I've heard stories of our compatriots from the other Baltic countries. They're very similar experiences, these wartime and post-war experiences. So it's really part of our responsibility to continue remembering and sharing the stories with friends, neighbors, and people who might not understand that, because I think it's important anywhere on the globe. Thank you so much for that and the research that you're doing in this area. Okay, Maria, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you. I first want to say thank you to the 3 ambassadors, to the Lithuanian Embassy, to Carl for the invitation to participate today. It's an honor to be on this panel with 2 very strong and influential and successful women. So thank you so much for having me. I'd like to share first a little bit about my personal family history, just as a brief intro. And then I'd like to share a bit about Mission Siberia, which I took part in 2019. And together with that, give a little bit of a short presentation for a new initiative that is emerging for Lithuanian American youth regarding a similar project regarding history. And then I'd like to end with sort of an uplifting personal note at the end. So Carl, I really enjoyed actually your intro at the very beginning of today's event when you said that you had spoken with your mother this past week and sort of recalling June 14th and those events. It was very heartwarming because I also was with my maternal grandmother for a few hours this weekend. And I had mentioned that, oh, grandma, June 14th is on Monday. And she told me this story a few times before, but it always leaves quite an impression on me. She actually recalls that night. She grew up by Kaunas, and her parents knew that if they stayed in Lithuania, they would likely be deported. And so on that night, they heard trucks driving around, showing up to people's doors and taking them away. And so her parents sent her and her brother into the rye fields behind their house, where she stayed overnight. She stayed there through the night with her one brother. And I'm not sure if it's that same night or a few nights later, but when it was during the night when her parents decided that it's not safe for us to be here, we'll likely be deported. And that's where their journey began, moving west through the displaced persons camps of Germany to the US, which is a similar story for actually all 4 of my grandparents. So I'm a 3rd generation Lithuanian American. And in 2019, like I had mentioned, I participated in a project called Mission Siberia. I actually have a few slides that I can show you of this project. Typically my presentations are about an hour for Mission Siberia. I will spare you an hour and just talk for maybe 4 or 5 minutes about this. I'm sure that the Lithuanian audience who's with us today has heard of this project, but for those of you who are not familiar with it, it began 15 years ago. Totally a youth initiative. Lithuanian youth wanted to show that they are in fact patriotic, that they do care about Lithuania and the preservation of Lithuanian history. And so with that started the idea of, hey, let's send a group of young Lithuanians to Siberia, to these places of deportation. And those young people will spend 1 or 2 weeks there at those places, looking for Lithuanian tombs and grave sites and cleaning them, and then coming back and sharing that history with others. I won't go over everything on this slide, but you can see just some basic statistics about the project, which had a very successful 15-year run. Unfortunately, this year it came to an end. But there is new initiatives being born, which is a very hopeful thing. But one number I do want to call attention to on this slide is what you see on the top left corner, that over 15 years, there have been more than 14,000 young Lithuanians who have applied to be a part of this project. So for example, the year that I participated, there was more than 1,000 applicants. 15 of us were chosen and we made up that final team. We were actually not let into Russia, not let into Siberia. So we went to Kazakhstan, which is fine because there was up to 80,000 Lithuanian political prisoners who served time there, who were deported to there. And so we spent 10 days there looking for Lithuanian graves, cleaning them up, meeting with locals. And we even built 3 of our own crosses while we were there. And so I'll sort of play this video just for some visual images of what the cemeteries in Kazakhstan look like. Those of you who have visited Lithuania And I'm sure it's very similar in Latvia and Estonia. The cemeteries there are pristine. People take very good care of them. People visit their relatives' tombstones on weekends and clean them up and maintain them. And it's nothing like that in Kazakhstan. And that's why this project was so important, because there's someone taking care of those tombstones and those graves. And you see actually what difficult work this was just to make it through these cemeteries. I had cuts and bruises all across my legs. It was close to 100 degrees every day. But this was basically our work day in and day out, looking for these graves, cleaning them up. We even marked the GPS locations, and we have this mass database so that Lithuanian people can see if we found a grave of one of their relatives. That being said, part of the preparation process is actually meeting with Lithuanian deportees and political prisoners who returned to Lithuania. There are a few of those people altogether, and a few of those people who are alive today, and that's why those meetings are very important. I got to meet with two people, actually, one deportee, one political prisoner, who shared their stories with me. But one particular case is a man, his name is Jurgis, who we met with before the expedition. And he was a political prisoner in Kazakhstan. His two daughters were born there. They both got sick, and one died when she was barely 8 months old. So this is her tombstone on the left here that Jurgis himself made. And he had this picture and he gave it to us. And he said, she's buried somewhere in this area. If you find her grave, I'll be very thankful. And we actually did find it on the second day of the expedition. It's the tombstone you see on the right here. So it looked very different, and that's why it was kind of hard to find. But once we found it and cleaned it up, we actually called Jurgis to tell him we had found it. And him and his other daughter were on the line, and they were immediately very thankful and very happy. And then we could tell right away that they were kind of crying and that it was emotional for them. And so of course we all started crying. And it was in that moment that I, and I think the whole team, realized what the purpose of this project is, and actually how important it is for Lithuanians to know where their relatives who were deported are buried, and that someone is taking care of them. So that was, as a person who has distant relatives who were deported, that was a very critical, I think, experience for me in understanding what this history means to Baltic people. I'll share just two more brief histories, sort of critical, important moments of the expedition. We were in one small village building one of our 3 crosses when this man came by. He is Ukrainian, from Ukraine originally, and he is the oldest person in that village and the only person who remembers what the labor camp that was in that village, what it looked like. I thought that these labor camps were still standing. There's virtually nothing left of them. And so he sort of took us for a little tour, for lack of a better word, through this village and explained that this is where the fence was, this is where the sick people would be, this is where the soldiers were, this is where the barracks were, and so on. And a very profound point that actually someone made after our time with him is that he is a perfect example of why oral histories are important and why it is important to learn the history of these older people or someone who has lived through something, because when he dies, with him dies the memory of what was there and what it looks like and the tragedies that happened there. So this was also sort of this aha moment that I had during the expedition of, it really is important, not just for young people, for anyone to take the time to find out their parents, their grandparents, anyone's history really, and why it's important to pass those on. So that was another profound moment. Like I said, we built 3 of our own crosses. We spent a long time thinking about where to build them. And so I just wanted to point out that this cross, that we did not make this cross ourselves. It actually disassembles into little cubes, little pieces. And we brought it with us from Lithuania to Kazakhstan, which I think is sort of symbolic. And then we assembled it and we erected it in this spot, which it's hard to tell from the picture, but it's right along the railroad tracks, where there was this sort of fallen apart concrete building that after meeting with locals, we learned was the separation point for the political prisoners who served time in that Gulag region. And so we learned that those political prisoners would be taken there by train, and they would wait in this building for days or weeks or months until they were taken to their respective labor camps. And so we decided to put our cross there to show that that is a historical site, because otherwise you would have no idea that there was anything there. And a final example, sort of notable moment from the expedition, is when we built our third and final cross. Just an interesting thing to note, the man that you see photographing us, his parents were political prisoners from Lithuania. He considers himself Lithuanian, but he doesn't speak Lithuanian or anything, and he grew up there. But he's really interesting because he is a photographer for the National Geographic. So we spent some time with him, and he sort of explained his family history. But anyways, we built this third cross. I think the second to last day, maybe of the expedition, and a really beautiful thing happened each time we built one of our three crosses. We would sort of stand in a half circle. There'd be a moment of silence, and then we would sing the Lithuanian anthem. Well, the last time that we did this with this third cross, I could not sing a single word of the anthem because I was crying. And it's in that moment, actually, that I realized how cool it is that I'm a third generation Lithuanian American in Kazakhstan, far from Chicago, far from Lithuania. Ooh, I'm sorry. Sorry. And that I can do this work. So that was another very profound moment for me. Yes, so that was the expedition. And unfortunately, it came to an end this year after 15 years. I think largely due to some political reasons that we haven't been let into Russia for so many years. But I'm very excited and very happy to announce that a very similar initiative is starting up in the US. It's called Šaknys in Lithuanian, or Roots. The idea, we're hoping that this can happen for many years. The idea is that it would take place in a different location across the US each year where Lithuanian communities either exist or used to exist. And of course, there will be the whole component of looking for these Lithuanian graves and cleaning them and marking the locations and putting up whether it's some sort of a statue or a cross to honor these places. But there's also going to be a whole academic portion to it where we will be reading texts about the Lithuanian American community, the history of that. We'll be learning about how to draw a family tree and learn about your family tree and resources to get all of that information. We will, so yes, essentially it's all about going back to your roots and learning about your roots. And so our first trip will be taking place this summer in Southern Illinois. We're hoping that throughout the years we can visit Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Washington, all across the US, and so that we can include as many young Lithuanian Americans as possible. And if I can end with just one more final note. Those of you who know me well know that I have a few speaking points that I like to bring up whenever I have the chance whenever I have the chance to share my thoughts. So one of those is the concept of the 7 generations. This is actually a Native American concept. It can be interpreted in many different ways, but the concept stands that at any given point, there are 7 generations that exist. You are the 4th generation in the middle. On your left, you have your parents and grandparents, which are the 2nd and 3rd generation here of 7. Generations 5 and 6 are your children and grandchildren. The 1st generation is anyone who has ever come before you. And the 7th generation is anyone who will ever come after you. And the idea here is that every decision you make, every action that you do, every action that you take has eternal consequences and impacts. Everything that my parents and my grandparents and anyone before me did impacted my life in some way. So an example of that, my great-grandparents and grandparents coming to the US, choosing to leave Lithuania for their safety, and deciding to hold on to that Lithuanian culture and those traditions and the language and passing that on to me. And that was 70, 80 years ago, and it has had such a profound impact on me. And so our role as that 4th generation is to act as a bridge from the past, from what happened before us to what's happening after us, and to pass on those histories. And so, like I mentioned, any decision made ever will affect everyone who comes after you. So I shared one personal example, but as on June 14th, there were some terrible decisions made, terrible actions taken, and those have had eternal impacts. And it's our job as a middle generation to remember those histories and pass on those histories to future generations so that that history does not repeat itself. And I think that Mission Siberia and our project Roots and other initiatives like that are a great way to get youth involved in that, or to get youth thinking in that kind of a mindset about passing on history so that history does not repeat itself. And I think that this idea of the 7 generations is a very good thing to keep in mind, especially for our 3 communities, the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian American communities, when thinking about our history, when thinking about the future of our communities, and when thinking about our youth and how to pass these things on to them so that the Baltics may continue to thrive and that history may not repeat itself. So that's it for me. I'm sorry for some emotional moments there, but thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Maria. And we're so glad that you were there and that you could share your experiences. I know that some of the online attendees today also share your emotion, because I think it's it's a very personal story. So a shout out to Skaidra Podzinas in Canada, who's a 3rd generation Canadian youth. And I know that we only have about 9 or 10 minutes left. We're going to have a couple questions, and there have been a lot of questions that have come in online, mostly with having to do again with resources, but maybe I can track one down over here, which I thought was interesting. I might, oh, here it is, by Edgar Vilkin. So by the name, maybe Latvian, I'm guessing, who writes, my great-grandparents and great-aunt were deported to Siberia. They returned 6 years later. Where can I find the location of their arrival in Siberia? I can only find the names in the book of deportation. So I know that there are resources out there, and maybe just to point out the work of Sandra Kalniet, who I believe is still a member of the European Parliament, Latvian, who was either deported or was born in Siberia, and has had an amazing story to tell and share in Europe with her European colleagues, and has also undertaken many trips, organized many trips to Siberia for Latvians, to look for their roots, part of their roots. But maybe just to start with Maria, so what about people who are looking still for connections to people who have gone to Siberia? You mentioned the GPS locations that you have recorded of the cemeteries, but in the work that you were doing and in your travels there and what you found out, what resources were available to you, and what could you recommend maybe for people who are interested in finding out the location of their their relatives?
Yeah, so I know that prior to our expedition, so we had a team leader who had gone on the expedition 15 times. And so he actually did a lot of work together with the Genocide Museum or the Genocide Center in Vilnius. They offered a lot of resources. I know that to find those cemeteries and learn more about especially the smaller cemeteries in Kazakhstan, a lot of reaching out to local Lithuanians there, who at this point are the children or grandchildren of former Lithuanian political prisoners or deportees. But I know that there are, in terms of a location, it would certainly take some sleuthing, and I think sort of making connections with the right people to either get you to, or to connect you with someone local from those areas, if you even have a slight idea in what area your relatives were deported to, or starting with the museums and centers in Vilnius or in whichever country, and contacting them, because I know that, for example, Lithuanians have very good databases of those names, and it often says to which region the person or the family was deported to. So I would start there.
Thank you so much. And I think those are things that those links, I know I've seen many of them online, and I'm familiar with some of the institutions in the Baltics, the Museum of Occupations in Latvia too, which is a great place for information. But just to maybe continue, in JBank for its part will continue to, I think, highlight maybe in our set of links to institutions, we may focus on something highlighting some of the institutions and research places that we've talked about today. And then just to say a word about the Roots project too, that anything that's out there, we can, and we'd be happy to share on our social media too going forward, just to to share the stories. I wanted to turn back to Rūta and Māra now to just to see if you had any additional comments or input to what was brought up. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, or anything else that you'd like to leave our online audience with today. So Rūta, maybe you first.
With regard to tracing, the records, and yes, I agree with Maria that what I've been told is that the institutions in Lithuania have very detailed records. So perhaps we could post some of those names, so some of the attendees have those resources to, to follow up. And lastly, just that I'm so grateful that this event exists, where we can all gather together to reflect and share, and I'm so grateful, because history divided us, but sometimes through these events we're united in story and study and remembrance, and that's really powerful. So thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a question in the meantime by Brett Matulis. How can we find out more about Project Saknes?
Yes, I was in the middle of typing a response. So the Lithuanian American Youth Association and the Lithuanian American community, we've been sharing information about it on our Facebook pages. And if there's any Instagram users, we also share it on the Instagram page for the Lithuanian American Youth Association. Yes, or I can probably put an email as well if anyone wants more info than what's on Facebook.
Okay. Right, yeah, I think we're all online somewhere. So Māra, anything else? And the last word is yours.
Thank you. No, again, yeah, I'll echo that. This is truly inspiring, and I'm grateful to be invited and be a part of this event. And as far as resources, same thing. I would say, I think the Occupation Museum and also the Totalitarian Results Center also may be helpful, but those are certainly those centers in Latvia. And so that's where I would start for tracing your relatives. And so I guess the takeaway is simply that I think that we should not wait until June 14th to come together like this, in the sense that we have, and I really, like to come away from these gatherings with action points. And I hope that one of the action items, and that I would love to follow up with my Lithuanian and Estonian colleagues and think about how we can pool our resources in making this history, taking action to remember and promote this history. And I'll just have one little also, talking point, or as Maria said, my point is that I don't think we are small nations. I don't think we are small countries, and we should get rid of that kind of self-deprecating description and really recognize our own strength that becomes even more larger as we come together.
Small is good. I always say that it's quality over quantity, but okay. Thank you all so much for that. We're out of time right now. I wanted to thank all of our panelists for just great way to get together here in many different locations all at once to share our experiences. And I totally agree. We should not just do this on June the 14th or on March the 25th. We should be thinking about this and doing this all along, because if we don't, the memory fades in progressive generations if it's not written down or recorded or on film even, let's say. I wanted to thank the wonderful team and the hosts here at the Lithuanian Embassy for providing the opportunity to come together, and also again to the 3 ambassadors for coming and sharing time with us today, and also to everybody out there for taking part of this. And I think it was well over capacity. Some people were writing me and saying, we're trying to get in. The meeting was recorded, so when you have a quiet moment, you can go back and reflect on it, or to take a look. And we will be together again sometime somewhere. Thank you so much once again, everybody.